Welcome to our treatment of Sparta, one of the most interesting polis and societies in ancient Greek history. We're going to divide up our discussion of Sparta into two main sections. The first is basically a discussion of Spartan history in general, which mainly devolves down to their wars with their neighbors to the west, the Messenians, and the formation of the Spartan state. Next, we're going to look at details of that Spartan state. We're going to look at the wider society of Sparta and Laconia, government, social organization, hierarchy, their education system, the agoge, athletics, and their religion. One of the things that comes up immediately when you talk about Sparta in archaic Greece, or just Greece in general, is how unique is Sparta? They've captured everybody's imagination from the ancients to the moderns. For example, in the archaic period, when the Lydian monarch, Croesus, secured his throne after a struggle with his half-brother, he contributed to the rebuilding of many parts of Greece and so had many contacts with ancient Greece. He was involved with the building of the Artemision at Ephesus and made many beautiful offerings to Greek shrines, especially Delphi. Now, the two cities, the two communities, the polis that he attempted to contract alliances with were Athens and Sparta. So even in the archaic period, these two polis were juxtaposed against each other. He sent messengers to get information about the different cities of Greece, and these messengers told him that the chief people among the Greeks were the Lacedaemonians among the Dorians and the Athenians among the Ionians. Croesus and the Spartans actually undertook a joint expedition together against the tyrant Polycrates of Samos. It's important when embarking on a study of ancient history to really be critical and think about our sources of information. Where do we get the information that we use to create these interpretations of the ancient world? This is especially important with Sparta. In the archaic period, we always start with Herodotus, who was active to the mid to late 5th century BCE. Herodotus is the father of history, and he's the main textual source for not only the archaic period, but the Persian Wars, which brought the period to an end and signaled the climax of his own work. Within his spiraling narratives and detailed reports from oral informants are many crucial and important passages on Spartan history, which are found nowhere else. Now, juxtaposed with the evidence of Herodotus is always Thucydides, who we'll meet numerous times later. Thucydides was active in the 5th century BCE in Athens, and he's the historian of the Peloponnesian War between Sparta and Athens in the latter half of the 5th century BCE in the classical period. Thucydides is known for his reliance on eyewitness accounts and scientific and accurate approach. Now, a generation after Thucydides, his fellow Athenian Xenophon, who was active in the late 5th, early 4th century BCE, was so enamored with Sparta that he had his son educated there and wrote numerous works which had to do with Sparta. One was a constitution of the state, along with an encomium or praise tract of Agesilaus, the most famous king of his era, the most famous Spartan king of his era. Much later, Plutarch, who was the late 1st century CE biographer active in the Antonine period of the Roman Empire, wrote sayings of the Spartans and sayings of Spartan women, as well as biographies of numerous important Spartan political figures, including the quasi-mythological Lycurgus. Of course, we also have the hard evidence of archaeology and numismatics, which tells us, of course, a little bit less than we would like to know. Traditionally, Sparta was thought to consist of 5 villages incorporated or sun-oicized into a city in the later Dark Ages upon the arrival of a people called the Dorians to their land. The Dorians were one of the ethnic groups of Greece. Now, the circumstances of the settlement of Sparta are highly contentious and mysterious. The ancients conceptualized their arrival as the return of the Heraclids, the sons of Heracles. And actually, modern scholars have traditionally favored a Dorian invasion, which is not actually borne out by the archaeological facts and is not an accepted explanation today. Archaeology suggests no continuity between the Bronze Age and Sparta of the Archaic period. In Laconia, the Dark Ages were very dark. Sparta was both isolated and easily defended. It had a good harbor, but Laconia itself was difficult to traverse over land due to the Taygetus mountain range, which ran right down the spine of the Peloponnese. Sparta was located on the Eurotas River and directly to the west of Mount Taygetus, which is about 2,400 meters high. To the north of Sparta is Arcadia, hilly uplands reaching about 1,000 meters in altitude. The basic contours of Spartan history are determined by their repeated conflicts with their neighbors to the west, the Messenians. The First Messenian War is generally considered to have happened in the middle of the 8th century, 740 to 720 BCE. Messenia was completely conquered by the Spartans, and the Messenians were all made helots, Helots are state-owned agricultural slaves who worked their own land for the citizen Spartans, the Spartiates. Now, the Second Messenian War is a revolt of these Helots. At around the middle of the 7th century in 650 BCE, these Helots revolted, taking an opportunity of the Spartan loss in one of their battles with their neighbor Argos. The final Spartan victory led to the full militarization of the Spartan state. Mount Ithome was central in both of these conflicts. It's a fortified strategic mountain in the Messenian plain. In the First Messenian War, the Messenians held it as their fort until the very end. Ithome was also the center of the Helot revolt in 465 BCE. This happened after an earthquake in Sparta killed many of the Spartians. This is sometimes considered to be the Third Messenian War. The Spartan victory in the Second Messenian War in the middle of the 7th century led to the full militarization and creation of the Spartan state as we know it, the mythology of the Spartan state. This order was idealized as eunomia, is a Greek word that means good governance, and was considered to be created by a certain figure named Lycurgus, who we'll meet a little bit later. The organization of Sparta had three main components: an economic component, a political component, and a socio-ritualistic component. The economic component centered on the Spartiate, who was the Spartan hoplite. Spartiates were full Spartan citizens and were also called homoioi, a word which means the similars or the peers. They were a body of several thousand men. As hoplites, they were completely supported by the servant helots, the slave helots, who worked Spartiates' private estates called kleroi. Spartiates were debarred from agricultural labor and from business activity. They were active, pure soldiers.
We were eager to join forces.
If it is blood you seek, you're welcome to join us.
But you bring only this handful of soldiers against Xerxes? You see, I was wrong to expect Sparta's commitment to at least match our own.
Doesn't it? You, there. What is your profession?
I'm a potter, sir.
And you, Arcadian. What is your profession?
Sculptor, sir.
You?
Blacksmith.
Spartans! What is your profession? You see, old friend, I brought more soldiers than you did.
The next level of the hierarchy of Spartan society were the Periesi, the dwellers around. These were neighboring communities with military obligations to Sparta. They conducted trade, produced goods, as well as provided military service to the Spartan state. They retained some form of self-government and were generally citizens, but with lesser rights. Now at the bottom of the pyramid were obviously the helots. These were enslaved Messenians who worked the kleroi, or allotments, for the Spartiates. Each year, the Spartans would formally declare a war, a state of war, to exist between Sparta and the helots, thereby allowing any Spartan to kill a helot without any civil penalty or fear of offending the gods by unsanctioned murder. By beating helots frequently and this declaration of war, forcing them to get drunk in public as an object lesson for young Spartans, and marking them out by having them wear dogskin caps and generally treating them with scorn, the Spartans consistently emphasized the otherness of the helots compared to themselves. In this way, the Spartans erected a moral barrier between themselves and their helots to justify their harsh treatment of their fellow Greeks. It's important to remember that, after all, these helots were just Greeks, like the Spartans. They spoke the same language. Sparta's constitution was called the Rhetra, or Things Spoken. It perhaps dates to the first half of the 2nd century, of course after the Second Messenian War, in the aftermath of that war. It seems to be our first preserved Greek constitution. We have a quote from it preserved in archaic poetry, but also more fully in Plutarch, the biographer who lived in the Antonine period of the Roman Empire, a full 1,000 years after the period we're talking about, the archaic period. But it has been cogently argued that this evidence might stem from one of the constitutions of Aristotle, written by either him or his students, and is thus accurate. Now, Plutarch says that Lycurgus obtained an oracle from Delphi about the creation of the Spartan state, which they determined he should call a Rhetra. And this is the way that it runs according to Plutarch. When thou hast built a temple to Zeus Silanius and Athena Silania, divided the people into Phili and into Obi, and establish a senate of 30 members, including the Archagaetae. Then, from time to time, Apaladzane, between Babica and Cnassian, and there introduce and rescind measures, but the people must have the deciding voice and the power. This 30-member Spartan state, or Boule council, was called the Gerousia, the Council of Old Men. It consisted of 2 kings, called the Archagaetae and the Retra, founding heroes, and a group of 28 men of over 60 years old. The Gerousia formulated proposals that were submitted to an assembly of all free adult males, or Spartiates. The assembly, just like in most Greek polis, was expected to approve the council's plans. There were also the 5 ephors.
No Spartan king has gone to war without the ephor's blessing.
The Persians claim their forces number in the millions. I hope for our sake they exaggerate. But there's no question we face the most massive army ever assembled.
Before your plan is heard, what do you offer?
These magistrates were chosen from the adult male citizenry at large, not after an age requirement. They convened the Gerousia and the assembly, and they held judicial powers of judgment and punishment, and could actually prosecute charges against a king and imprison him until his trial. This was an important check on the powers of the twin kings of Sparta. The kings had a religious authority and force in Sparta. Xenophon, in his Constitution of the Spartans, tells us that all men rise from their seats in the presence of the king except for the ephors. The ephors, on behalf of the polis, and the king, on his own behalf, swear an oath to each other every month. The king swears that he will exercise his office according to the established laws of the polis, and the polis swears that will preserve his kingship undisturbed if he abides by his oath. Sparta had 2 kings. They rose from twin patrilineal lines, that is, through the father. They were called the Agiad and the Eurypontid lines, from Agis and Eurypon. Both Agis and Eurypon considered themselves or fashioned themselves as sons of Heracles. Both kings were thought to descend directly from the hero Heracles himself. The story goes that after the death of Heracles, Eurystheus, the tormentor of the hero, ejected his sons, the Heraclidae, from Greece. And Heracles' grandson, Temenus, met up in his exile with an ethnic group of Greeks called the Dorians in the north, and in 3 companies, led by the individuals Temenus, Cresphontes, and Aristodemus, came back, returned, and conquered the Peloponnese, founding Sparta. The 3 figures divided the island into 3 parts, of which Cresphontes took Messenia, Temenus took the Argolid, and the sons of Aristodemus, Eurysthenes and Procles, took Sparta, Lacedaemon. Their sons were Agis and Eurypon, thus founding the dual kingship of Sparta. The myth of the return of the descendants of Heracles to the Peloponnese functioned as a charter myth for the division of the Peloponnese between different Dorian states, Messenia, Sparta, and the Argolid. It also functioned as a charter myth for the dominance or the hegemony of the Dorian Greeks in the area surrounding Laconia. An entirely different type of authority in Sparta was the influence of the quasi-mythological lawgiver Lycurgus. He was the creator of the famed eunomia, or good government. In Greek, his name is Lycurgos, Lycurgus, which either translates to the light worker or the wolf worker. His dates are completely unknown, but he was unanimously thought to be responsible for all of Sparta's codes and laws, military and political institutions, which he brought from Crete. While Sparta's government, or eunomia, was perhaps the product of coherent design, it is actually unlikely to be the work of a single legislator. It is more probable that many elements emerged throughout a longer-term process of adaptation and change. Lycurgus is interestingly absent from Tertius's 7th century small account of the Retra, which we mentioned above. This undermines later belief in his all-encompassing founding role. It is incontrovertible, however, that in the archaic and classical periods, the Greeks, and especially the Spartans, unanimously believed that Lycurgus was the progenitor, was the creator of their entire society. Now, the third part of the Spartan system was social and ritual. Every future Spartiate, or full citizen, except the twin kings and their immediate heirs, took part in an austere public education system called the agoge. This was followed in adulthood by participation in common eating halls or messes called societia, and in military training and mandatory service in the army. The helots were the engine of the system of dependent labor in Sparta. Enslaved in their own territories to the west of Laconia and Messenia, they were technically owned by the state. The extent to which individual Spartiate owners could control the helots is actually not known. They were state-owned. As we mentioned, Messenian helots revolted against Sparta several times. In fact, guarding against revolt was probably the guiding principle in the modern, so to speak, Spartan state, the state that was created in the Second Messenian War. Its creation was a result of the final complete ending of the Messenian rebellions in the 7th century. The agoge, or the upbringing, is the name commonly given to the citizen training system at Sparta. It probably began in the 6th century BCE and survived with interruptions until the mid-4th century BCE. There were 3 general age classes, probably representing the ages 7 to 13, 14 to 19, and 20 to 29. The initiates were trained by older youths and gradually were presented at the societia, or mess halls, and then the army. They competed for places among the king's bodyguard. Now, a select group of these initiates in the agoge participated in an activity called the crypteia. Here they would conceal themselves by day and undergo a lengthy test of individual endurance without equipment in winter.
Constantly tested, tossed into the wild, left to pit his wits and will against nature's fury. It was his initiation, his time in the wild, for he would return to his people a Spartan, or not at all.
Some evidence tells us that they were instructed to randomly kill helots in this initiation. At the conclusion of the agoge, each new Spartiate was given a kleros, or an allotment of land, and state-owned helots to work it. Societia were the mess halls. Taken together, they are the system of eating houses used by the Spartans, where the men dined with those of their military unit. They generally had 15 people each. Each member provided barley, cheese, figs, condiments, and wine from the work of the helots on the kleroi. The Spartan subservience to collective interests and military training was often held up as a model by both the ancient and the modern. The exiled Spartan king Demaratus tells the Persian king Xerxes, "Spartans fight till the death, no retreat even if outnumbered. They fear the law too much, and disgrace." Here's a poem from the archaic poet Tertius. "Let each man plant himself stoutly, and stay with both feet firmly upon the ground. Let him set foot beside foot, rest shield on shield, crest on crest, helmet on helmet, and let him fight his man with breast approach to breast, holding his sword hilt or long spear. To die after falling in the vanguard is a good thing for a brave man during battle on behalf of his native land. But to leave his city and rich fields and go begging is of all things the most painful. Hateful shall he be amongst those whom he comes, and he shames his family, and every dishonor and misery follow. So let us fight with courage for our country, and for our children let us die and never spare our lives. Young men, remain beside each other and fight. Do not begin shameful flight or fear. Your elders, whose knees no longer nimble, do not flee and leave them. For this is shameful, that an older man should fall in front lines, lying before a youngster, his head white already and beard grizzled, breathing out his brave spirit in the dust, holding his bloody genitals in his own hands. Things shameful for the eyes and inspiring wrath. But let each man plant himself stoutly and stand with both feet firmly on the ground, biting his lip with his teeth." Now, women have a unique place in Sparta. Unlike Athens, women could actually own land because the male population declined throughout the classical period and more land came into the hands of women in later Spartan history. We also have evidence from Pausanias that uniquely, Spartan girls competed at the games for Hera at Olympia. Spartan women had a reputation for beauty and forthrightness. Caniska, a Spartan, is the first woman to win a chariot race in 396 and 392 BCE, during her accomplishments and heritage. "Kings of Sparta were my fathers and brothers, and I, Caniska, winning the race with my chariot of swift-footed horses, erected this statue. I assert that I am the only woman in Greece who won the crown." The strict communal social apparatus of Sparta contributed to this interesting standing of women, because women needed to take more control over the actual functioning of the state, the day-to-day businesses, the organization of the kleroi, because the men were simply at their mess halls and training for war all day. Now, Sparta was a very religious polis. The worship of Artemis or Thea was clearly a central part of Spartan life. We have found about 100,000 or so small dedications at her shrine, including masks and many lead figurines. Some of the most interesting evidence of Spartan religious activities is found concerning Artemis or Thea. Amazingly, we are told that at her festival, youths undergoing the Spartan military training, the agoge, sought to steal cheese that had been placed on the altar, and if they were caught, they were whipped in front of bystanders. It also may have been these initiates or ephebes, again, who wore the various masks that we have found in her sacred precinct. At the Amyclaion, a temple of Apollo at an ancient population center slightly outside of Sparta called Amyclae, the travel writer Pausanias describes the throne of Bathycles. It was a 6th century BC altar with a relief sculpture by the artist Bathycles, which included the hero Hyacinthus' apotheosis, or rising up to heaven, with his sister. Hyacinthus' death and removal to heaven was an important element of the 3-day festival, the Hyacynthia. Hyacinthus received a preliminary sacrifice on the first day at his tomb, which formed the base of Apollo's statue. The statue was famous in antiquity. It was approximately 14 meters tall, it was wooden, lined with bronze plates, while the head bore a helmet, the figure carried a spear and a bow. The Menelaon was the Spartan shrine to the Homeric figures Menelaus and Helen at ancient Therapne. Both Menelaus and his wife Helen were important parts of the Iliad and also important figures in the religious landscape of Sparta itself. Helen had 2 shrines where she was remembered and worshipped in a role far different than that is presented in the Iliad. The Menelaon, where the pair were considered to be buried, was constructed around 700 BCE, and it occupied a position high above the Eurotas River, about 2 miles southeast of Sparta. The structure is a rectangular terrace reached by a ramp with a small temple on top called a Naiskos. Amazingly, it is actually on the site of a small Mycenaean palace. It is actually the earliest of its kind on the Greek mainland. It's interesting to think about the significance of this Bronze Age site to the much later builders of the Menelaon in the Archaic period. So there's much more to say about Sparta, but next time we're going to turn to the development of Sparta's famous rival, Athens.